Michael Jackson is walking onto a stage he was never announced on, and James Brown has no idea he's coming. It's June 2003, the BET Awards, and Brown has just finished tearing the roof off the building the way only he can. And now comes the sacred part, the ritual every soul fan on earth knows, the cape. For 50 years, one man and one man only has draped that cape over the Godfather's shoulders. Tonight, out of the darkness at the edge of the stage, it isn't him. It's the king of pop, the most famous entertainer alive, carrying the cape himself, walking toward James Brown like a servant approaching a throne. The audience realizes it before Brown does, and the room detonates. Brown turns, and the look that crosses his face in that instant, shock, disbelief, and then something close to tears, is the payoff of a debt that started 40 years earlier in a cramped bedroom in Gary, Indiana, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Stay with me, because this story ends 3.5 years later in an arena in Augusta, Georgia, with a golden casket, 8,500 people, and Michael Jackson standing over the body of the man who built him, saying the sentence he had waited his whole life to say out loud. To understand why the biggest star on earth would carry another man's cape like an honor, you have to go to that bedroom in Gary. It's the mid-1960s, and in a tiny steel town house crammed with 9 children, a little boy is asleep until his mother shakes him awake. She isn't waking him for school, and she isn't waking him because something's wrong. She's waking him because James Brown is on television. That was the rule in the Jackson house, and Michael would tell the story for the rest of his life. No matter what time it was, whenever James Brown appeared on TV, his mother got him out of bed to watch, and the little boy would sit inches from the screen, transfixed, studying one thing above everything else: the feet, the impossible feet, the slides, the spins, the glides, the footwork so fast the eye lost it. He would get genuinely angry, furious, he said, when the camera cut away from Brown's feet, because the feet were the secret, and he was trying to steal it. When I saw him move, I was mesmerized, Jackson said later. Right then and there, I knew that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Millions of children watched James Brown on television in the 1960s. One of them was taking notes that would change the world, and the practice never stopped. In a house with 9 kids and no room to breathe, the boy drilled those stolen steps the way other children played. In the kitchen, in the living room, in front of a mirror when he could get one. His brothers sang, Michael studied. He wasn't imitating a star the way kids imitate stars, for fun, for a laugh. He was reverse engineering a machine. How does the foot slide without leaving the floor? How does the spin stop on a dime exactly on the beat? How does a man collapse and rise and make 10,000 people believe both? Those weren't questions a 5-year-old should be able to ask. He asked them anyway, night after night, of a flickering black and white screen, and the man on the screen, without ever knowing it, was conducting the most important master class in the history of popular music for an audience of one small boy in Indiana. And here's the part that most people never connect. When that little boy was 10 years old, he walked into the most important audition of his life, the tryout that would decide whether the Jackson brothers got a contract with Motown Records. 10 years old, one shot, the biggest label in black music watching. And what did Michael Jackson do in that room? He did James Brown. The spins, the drops, the footwork, the scream. A 10-year-old channeling the Godfather of soul, move for move, because those were the moves he'd been rehearsing since he was 5, in front of a television in the middle of the night. Motown signed them, The greatest career in the history of popular music was launched in that room on borrowed footwork, borrowed from the man in the cape. Michael never hid it. He said it plainly over and over for decades. James Brown was his greatest inspiration. Not one of them. The one. Now, Brown knew. Of course he knew. He watched this kid rise through the 70s doing steps that had his fingerprints all over them. And unlike almost everything else in his life, this was a theft James Brown never once complained about. And that tells you something, because this channel has never pretended James Brown was a gentle man. This is the man who fined his own musicians mid-song for a wrong note, who replaced his entire band overnight, who guarded his legacy, his money and his crown, with a ferocity that scared grown men. He spent his whole life making people pay for taking things from him. And yet the biggest theft of all, a little boy in Indiana stealing his entire vocabulary of movement and building the biggest career on earth with it, that one he treated like a gift, because it was the one form of tribute that couldn't be faked. Money can be flattery. Words can be flattery. But a man doesn't spend 40 years moving like you unless, somewhere inside, he never stopped being that 5-year-old in front of the television. The student's whole body was a thank-you note, and the master could read it. They crossed paths across the years, the way royalty does. And one night in 1983 at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, Brown did something that closed the circle in front of everyone. Michael was in the audience. This is the Thriller year, the year Michael Jackson became the most famous human being on the planet. And James Brown, mid-show, stopped and called him up out of the crowd, onto the Apollo stage, the holy ground. And the biggest star in the world climbed up like a nervous kid, hugged him, borrowed a few bars of the groove, glided across the boards with the very footwork he'd learned from this man, and then handed the stage right back. The king of pop, at the absolute peak of his powers, still deferred to the Godfather. On Brown's stage, there was never any question about the order of things. There was the teacher, and there was the student was the most famous man alive, and it didn't matter. Which brings us back to 2003 and the Cape, because now you can feel what that moment actually was. You have to understand what the Cape means. The Cape routine is the most famous piece of theater in soul music. At the climax of the show, spent, drenched, broken by his own performance, James Brown would collapse, and his faithful MC, Danny Ray, a small, dignified man in a suit, would drape the cape over his shoulders and lead him away like a fallen king. And Brown would throw it off and return to the microphone, again and again, resurrection after resurrection. For half a century, that cape was Danny Ray's sacred duty. Nobody else touched it. It would be like somebody else carrying the crown at a coronation. And that night, at the BET Awards, as Brown finished his performance and the moment of the cape arrived, Danny Ray didn't walk out. Michael Jackson did. It was Michael's own idea. He had planned the surprise himself, kept it secret, and insisted on it. The most famous entertainer on earth chose, in front of the entire industry, to cast himself in the servant's role, to carry the master's cape, to place it on the master's shoulders with his own hands. Think about every award Michael Jackson ever won, every record he broke, every throne he sat on, and the gesture he chose, the one he engineered in secret because it mattered that much to him, was to publicly kneel, not literally, but in every way that counts, before the man whose feet he'd studied at 5 years old. Brown's face in that moment says everything. The shock, the delight, and underneath it, something that looks a great deal like a father being honored by a son. He was so overjoyed, he had the band strike the music back up, right there, so the two of them could trade steps one more time. The teacher and the student, side by side, doing the same footwork 40 years apart. And for a few seconds, the whole history of American entertainment was standing on one stage. The man who invented the language and the man who spoke it to the largest audience any performer ever had, moving together, mirror images across a generation. People who were in that room say you could feel it, that this wasn't an award show moment anymore. It was a passing of something. And then Michael took the microphone with tears in his eyes and said it to the whole room. Since I was a child, at 6 years old, he was the one I looked up to more than any other entertainer, and I still do today. 3.5 years later, on Christmas morning, 2006, James Brown died. He was 73. He had outrun poverty, prison, the industry, the taxman, and every room that ever underestimated him, and he went out with perfect showman's timing on Christmas Day, a date nobody would ever forget. They buried him the way you bury an emperor. His body traveled to the Apollo Theater in a white glass-walled carriage drawn by horses through the streets of Harlem, thousands walking and weeping alongside, and then home to Augusta, Georgia, to an arena that already bore his name, where more than 8,500 people packed the hall, and thousands more stood outside in the streets listening on loudspeakers, having lined up in the rain before dawn. Inside, the Godfather of Soul lay in a golden casket, dressed the only way he could be: black jacket, gloves, red shirt, and sequined shoes, even in death, dressed for the stage. And the funeral itself refused to be a funeral. The band played. They played I Feel Good. They played It's a Man's World. And 8,500 grieving people did the only thing you can do to honor James Brown. They got up. They clapped. They shouted. They danced in the aisles of his own memorial, in the town where he had once shined shoes for pennies, in an arena that carried his name. Al Sharpton, who had toured with him as a young man, put the whole journey in one sentence. When James Brown started singing, he said, "We were sitting in the back of the bus. Look how far the man in that casket had carried everybody, and Michael Jackson came. Of course he came. These were the years when Michael barely appeared in public at all, hounded, hidden, half vanished from the world. It didn't matter. He came to Augusta, and he stood at the podium over the casket of the man who built him, in front of 8,500 people in tears, and he finally said the whole thing out loud, as a eulogy. James Brown is my greatest inspiration. He told them about his mother waking him in the night. He told them about sitting in front of that television. He told them, "When I saw him move, I was mesmerized. I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, because of James Brown." The most famous entertainer alive, standing over a casket in Georgia, telling the world that everything, all of it, the moonwalk, the magic, the whole empire of movement that defined pop music for a generation, traced back to the man lying in front of him in sequined shoes. And before the world was let in, he had gone to that casket and leaned over the man himself and said a private goodbye that those in the room never forgot. So what do we do with this story? The honest thing, as always. James Brown was a hard man. This channel has shown you the fines, the firings, the iron and the ego, and none of that stops being true. But greatness leaves two kinds of legacy. There's the kind you guard, the money, the crowns, the credit, and Brown guarded his like a fortress. And then There's the kind you give away without ever deciding to. The kind that escapes through a television screen at 2 in the morning and lands in a 5-year-old in Gary, Indiana, and becomes the foundation of the next 50 years of music. Every artist who ever moonwalked, every performer who ever dropped to a split, every entertainer who ever turned a stage into a battlefield, they are all, whether they know it or not, quoting James Brown. Michael Jackson was simply the one honest enough and great enough to spend his whole life saying so, with his words when he could, and with his feet every single night. The Cape tells the whole story, if you watch it closely. For 50 years, the Cape meant the same thing. The king falls, and the king rises. And the last great image of it isn't Danny Ray at all. It's the most famous man on earth, carrying it out of the darkness with his own hands, draping it over his teacher's shoulders, the student finally getting to serve. 2.5 years after that funeral, Michael Jackson was gone too. The student followed his teacher sooner than anyone imagined, but for one night in 2003, they stood on the same stage, doing the same steps, wearing the same history, and the little boy from Gary, Indiana, finally got to give the Cape back. Subscribe for more true stories from music's greatest legends, and tell me in the comments, who was the hero that made you fall in love with what you love?